In the frozen heart of January 1883, in the remote settlement of Crow Creek, while other homesteaders huddled indoors as the blizzard raged, Andrew Colby was out in the storm following his dog. The animal refused to leave a particular snowbank, digging relentlessly. What the dog uncovered beneath the ice was not a stray bone, but a hidden trapper's cache: furs, dried meat, kerosene, enough to save 4 stranded families. But the cache belonged to a man everyone believed was dead. Andrew Colby was a quiet homesteader, a man who trusted his dog's instincts more than most men he knew. His dog was a thick-furred mixed breed that had already saved him from a broken river ice the winter before. Now, with the entire Crow Creek settlement nearing starvation, trapped by back-to-back blizzards, the buried cache felt like a miracle. But it wasn't just an abandoned stash. Scratched into a tin plate inside was a name: Edgar Dunn, a veteran trapper who had vanished 2 years earlier without a trace. How did his supplies end up beneath a snowbank at the worst possible moment? And what other secrets were still waiting out there in the white? The answer would turn a desperate find into a legacy. Crow Creek was not a town so much as a handful of stubborn families scattered along a frozen basin where the wind never rested. By January, the settlement had been cut off for nearly 3 weeks. Snow blocked the wagon trails like a white wall. The nearest supply post was 40 miles south, a distance that might as well have been 400 once the drifts set in. Wood supplies were thinning. The last of the autumn grain had been stretched into a thin porridge that was now gone. Andrew Colby kept his family inside their small pine cabin, his wife Alina wrapping their 8-year-old son in every blanket they owned, the child's cough a constant dry rasp that tightened Andrew's chest every time he heard it. 4 other families in the settlement faced the same cold arithmetic: food running out, livestock already lost, nothing to hunt because the game had long since moved lower out of the mountains. Andrew's dog was the one thing in Crow Creek that behaved as though winter didn't exist. The dog was a big, thick-furred mongrel with a barrel chest and yellow eyes that always seemed to be staring at something just beyond sight. Andrew had named him Kai, short for nothing, and the animal had already proven his worth the previous March when he dragged Andrew out of a broken ice shelf on the river, latched onto the man's coat collar, and pulled until his paws bled. Since then, Andrew trusted the dog more than he trusted most weather signs. But in the 3rd week of January, Kai started acting wrong. Every morning the dog would claw at the door until Andrew let him out, then vanish beyond the woodpile. He wouldn't come when called. He wouldn't take food. He would just stand near an unremarkable snowbank beneath an old split cottonwood tree at the eastern edge of the homestead, staring down at the frozen ground, whining low in his throat. Andrew's neighbors noticed. Henry Miller, the eldest homesteader in the settlement, told Andrew the dog had probably scented a frozen rabbit and was wasting his time. "That animal's got more loyalty than sense," Miller said, "and you've got less firewood than you need to be chasing him around." Andrew grunted and agreed, but Kai kept going back. That evening, Alina said something that made Andrew pause. "The dog, not trying to eat anything, Andrew. He's trying to show you something." She had seen Kai the winter before the river ice broke, acting the same way, packing, digging. Then the ice cracked under Andrew and the dog was already moving. Andrew lay awake that night listening to the wind and the boy's fevered breathing, and the next morning, with the temperature still 40 below and the sky a pale purple bruise over the basin, he followed Kai out to the cottonwood. The dog was already digging. Not the frantic pawing of a bored animal, but deliberate, patient excavation, clearing spoonful after spoonful of packed snow from a single spot. Andrew watched for a long moment, the cold biting through his gloves, then finally knelt and began digging with his hands alongside the dog. The snow was dense, almost like stone, frozen through from weeks of compaction. His fingers went numb. Then, nearly 3 feet down, his knuckle struck something solid: wood. A flat, rough-hewn plank, not tree bark, not deadfall. Andrew scraped the ice away and uncovered the outline of a buried chest, maybe 3 feet across, sealed with waxed canvas. Kai sat back on his haunches and began to whimper, not from hunger or cold, from urgency. Andrew worked the lid free. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and frozen solid, lay 20 pounds of dried venison, a clay jar of rendered bear fat, two tightly rolled bison robes, and a small tin of kerosene sealed with sap. Beneath the provisions, a metal plate the size of a man's hand was scratched with a single name: Edgar Dunn. The name stopped Andrew colder than the wind. Edgar Dunn was not a stranger. He was a legend in the territory, a solitary trapper who had last been seen heading into the Bighorn foothills in the autumn of 1881, promising he'd return before the first heavy snow. He never did. 2 winters passed. People assumed he'd been caught in a slide or simply frozen dead in a gulch, another name forgotten by spring. Nobody had looked for him long. The frontier didn't have time for missing men. Andrew carried the cash back to the cabin piece by piece while his mind reeled. The food alone could keep his family and the 4 others alive for another 2 weeks. But the name on the plate made the whole thing feel less like a miracle and more like a trespass. Alina stared at the supplies spread across the floor, the bison robes and the tinned kerosene, and quietly asked the question that every homesteader in Crow Creek would soon have to answer. What if he comes back for it? Andrew didn't have a response, because nobody knew whether Edgar Dunn was dead or simply somewhere else, waiting for the thaw. Word of the discovery passed from chimney smoke to chimney smoke across the settlement within hours. At night, Henry Miller and 2 other elders, Owen Tarbell and Jacob Lansing, crowded into Andrew's cabin to examine the cache. They studied the supplies, the metal plate, the waxed seams on the chest. Then Miller picked up the kerosene tin and said what no one wanted to admit. This is a man's wintering stash. Trappers bury these so they can double back and resupply. If Dunn's alive out there, we're robbing him blind. Andrew's jaw tightened. If he's dead, we're letting 4 families starve over a ghost. The tension between them filled the small cabin more heavily than the wood smoke. But the real blow came when Andrew opened the ledger tucked into the bottom of the chest. The pages were stiff with frost but legible. A hand-drawn map, crude but precise, sketched out 3 more cache locations to the north and east, each one marked with specific landmarks. A bent pine, a boulder split in two, a creek fork shaped like a snake's tongue. The final entry was a single line of writing that had been pressed so hard into the paper the ink had nearly bled through. If I do not return by first snow, seek the second cache at Split Rock, then the third, then the fourth. The pattern will save you. Do not break the pattern. The sentence ended there, but beneath it, in smaller letters, was a warning. And trust no stranger on the trail. That was when the dog growled. Not at the map, not at the men in the cabin. Kai was facing the window, hackles raised, a low, vibrating rumble building in his chest. Everyone stopped. The wind outside had gone silent, one of those sudden unnatural stillnesses that old-timers called the held breath. Andrew looked up from the ledger and slowly walked to the window. Through the frosted glass, something dark shifted against the snowline near the cottonwood where the cache had been buried. Not an animal. The shape was too tall. It stood motionless for a long beat, then disappeared back into the swirling white. Andrew set the ledger down and reached for his coat. The discovery that might save Crow Creek had just become more dangerous than anyone knew. Who else was out there watching them? And what did Edgar Dunn's warning really protect against? Andrew yanked the door open and stepped into the frozen night, Kai already lunging ahead toward the cottonwood. The wind had died to an unnatural stillness, the kind that makes every breath sound like a footstep. Behind him, Henry Miller grabbed the lantern, its flame blooming weakly against the dark, and Jacob Lansing followed with a heavy skinning knife. The 3 men crossed the yard in a tight cluster, boots crunching through the crusted snow. By the time they reached the place where the cache had been buried, the figure was gone. But where it had stood, a series of deep, fresh tracks punched through the powder, leading east toward the frozen creek bed. Not animal tracks, not the broad prints of a man in snowshoes, but the uneven, staggering gait of someone moving in worn leather boots. Someone who had been standing there for a long time, watching before they fled. Andrew knelt. The tracks were human, but something was wrong. The left print sank deeper, the toe dragging. An old injury maybe, or exhaustion. A few feet farther, a dark patch stained the snow. Not blood, not yet frozen, tobacco spit. Whoever was out there had been there long enough, comfortable enough to chew and wait. Henry lowered the lantern and shook his head. Somebody knows about the cash. Somebody's been watching long before we dug it up. Jacob gripped the knife tighter and stared into the dark. Could be a drifter, could be Dunn himself. Henry's voice went flat. If it's Dunn, why wouldn't he just come to the door? Why skulk in the trees like a thief? The question hung in the air with no answer. Back inside the cabin, the three men spread the ledger open on the table, the firelight catching the rough map on the yellowed pages. Andrew tapped the second mark. Split Rock, that's the next cache. If we're going to keep everyone alive, we need those supplies, but we also need to know what we've stepped into. Alina watched from beside their son's pallet, her face pale. You're going out into that storm after a ghost. Andrew didn't answer because she wasn't asking, and they both knew the settlement had no choice. The food from the first cache would buy maybe 10 days for 4 families. The other caches could buy them spring. The unknown figure outside meant the clock was ticking faster. The next morning, at first gray light, Andrew, Henry, and a younger homesteader named Tom Carrick set out for Split Rock. They took Kai, a sled, and enough gear to dig. The map led them northeast along the frozen creek, through a landscape that looked like the world had forgotten its own shape. The cold was a physical weight pressing on their chests. Every sound seemed magnified, a branch snapping under the weight of ice, the distant groan of deep snow settling, the whisper of wind cutting through the hills. And behind them, too often, the silence felt shaped by something else. Tom noticed it first. When they stopped to rest, the silence behind them was too complete, as if something else had stopped moving the same moment they did. Kai kept turning his head, a low rumble building in his throat. We're being followed, Tom muttered. Henry grunted. A man don't need a dog to know that. Question is why they haven't made a move. They found Split Rock just before noon, a massive granite boulder cleaved in two by centuries of frost, exactly as the map described. Beneath the northern face, half buried under a drift, was a cairn of flat stones that looked too deliberate to be natural. Andrew dug first, his shovel biting through the frozen crust, then into the softer snow beneath. A foot down, he uncovered a second wooden chest, smaller than the first, sealed with the same waxed canvas. But when they opened it, the chest was not full. It held maybe a third of the supplies the first cache contained. A bundle of dried fish, a sack of frozen beans, a small leather pouch of black powder. And lying on top of everything, a folded piece of oilskin with fresh writing in charcoal, the letters shaky but sharp. You took from the first. You'll be needing what's in the third, but the fourth is the one that matters most. Don't make me regret leaving the map. Not an old note, not from 2 years ago. Fresh, written within days. The stranger wasn't just watching, he was guiding them, challenging them, or warning them. Henry read the words twice, then looked up with cold eyes. He knows we have the ledger. He knows we'll follow the pattern. That means he's been close enough to see us leave, close enough to watch us dig this chest out. Tom's voice cracked. We're being herded, like game. Kai suddenly bristled and charged up the ridge behind the rock, barking furiously. Andrew ran after him, reaching the crest just in time to see a figure disappear over the next rise, moving with that same dragging step. He could see the shape of a man in heavy furs, a rifle slung across his back, a hat pulled low. Not Dunn's description exactly. Dunn was a taller man, red-bearded, but 2 years in the wild can change anyone. The figure vanished into a stand of twisted pine, and Andrew knew that chasing a man who didn't want to be caught in this terrain was suicide. They were being led somewhere, and the comment about the fourth cache made clear. This was not just about supplies. Something far more valuable waited at the end of Dunn's pattern, and someone else wanted it. That night, huddled in a lean-to against the wind, they debated turning back. But Henry, the old man who had lost a son to the Cheyenne and a wife to cholera, said quietly, "We're already in the snare. The third cache is a day north, at a place called Snake Tongue Fork. The fourth is marked only as the icebox. These aren't just winter stores. Edgar Dunn was a trapper who stashed furs and pelts worth a fortune in eastern markets. A full winter's take of prime beaver and marten could set a man up for years. That ledger map leads to his trade goods, hidden before he disappeared. And whoever is out there knows we have the map now. They'll follow us to the money, then strip us at the end of it all." A grim silence settled over the group. The stakes had shifted from mere survival to something darker, a treasure hunt where the prize was deadly. The next section of the trail followed a narrow gully that twisted between high banks, the snow here deeper and the wind a constant low howl. The silence they'd felt earlier was replaced by noise, a rushing that sounded almost like water but was only the wind funneled through the narrow cut. It made it impossible to hear anyone approaching. They walked in shifts, one man always facing backward. Twice Kai snarled at empty space, but no figure appeared. The pursuing stranger had become a ghost, present by absence, always at the edge of perception. Tom began to crack. At one point he stopped walking and said, "What if he's already got the fourth cache? What if we're walking into an ambush?" Henry grabbed him by the arm and pulled him forward. "What if your family starves while you stand here worrying? Keep moving." At Snake Tongue Fork, the creek split into two channels like a snake's forked tongue, exactly as sketched. A dead pine, lightning-struck and twisted, served as the marker. They dug near the trunk, and this time they found not just a chest but a canvas-wrapped bundle the size of a man. When Andrew cut through the frozen cords, they uncovered nearly 50 pounds of fine pelts. Beaver marten, a single silver fox pelt that glinted even in the pale light. The furs alone would buy a whole settlement's worth of supplies if they could ever get them to a trading post. But tucked carefully beneath the furs was another note, this time written on a torn page from a leather notebook. The handwriting was tighter, more frantic. "Sheep Creek Cabin, 3 miles north, I'm there. Come if you want the rest and an explanation. But come alone. If I see more than one man, I'll burn the whole cache and disappear for good." Henry grabbed the note before Andrew could hide it. "You're not going alone. This is exactly how a trap is set." Andrew looked at the dog, then at the furs, then back toward the south where his wife and boy were waiting. "He's got the biggest prize stashed somewhere," Andrew said. "And I think he's hurt. The tracks, the dragging foot. He's not running from us, he's running out of time." Henry shook his head. "Or he's a killer who used Dunn's name to bait us." The conflict was tearing the group apart. Tom wanted to take the furs and head back. Henry insisted on staying together. Andrew, holding the note, saw something hiding in the bottom fold. A small silver button, unmistakably from a woman's coat, scratched with initials. MD, not Edgar Dunn's wife, because Dunn had no wife anyone knew about, but maybe a daughter or a sister. The mystery of the old trapper had just sprouted new branches, and they all bent toward that cabin at Sheep Creek. As night fell again, they made the hardest decision yet. Andrew would go ahead at dawn, alone as the note demanded, but Henry and Tom would follow half a mile behind, close enough to intervene if guns fired. The dog would stay with Andrew, an early warning system. The storm began to build again that night, a fresh blizzard rolling in from the north, and they knew that by morning the trip to Sheep Creek might be impossible. If the stranger in the cabin burned those supplies, 4 families in Crow Creek would die. If the stranger was lying about the cache, Andrew was walking straight into a barrel. And somewhere in the dark, the figure with the dragging foot was waiting, as invested in the outcome as they were, perhaps more. The secret Edgar Dunn had buried in the frozen ground was about to speak. The sun never rose that morning. Instead, a dim gray glow bled across the horizon, swallowed quickly by driving snow. Andrew left before dawn, as he had promised, walking into the teeth of a new blizzard that erased the world behind him within 20 strides. Kai led the way, his thick fur coated white, his head low against the wind. The temperature had dropped so fast Andrew's eyelashes froze together, and the wound on his left palm where he'd scraped it digging the third chest throbbed with every heartbeat. The map was folded inside his coat, but he didn't need it anymore. Dunn's instructions were burned into his memory: 3 miles north along the creek, then a sharp left at a split boulder, and the cabin would appear in a hollow beneath a stand of dead aspen. The trek took nearly 3 hours through snow that reached his thighs in places. Twice, Andrew broke through a crust and sank to his waist, the cold seizing his lungs so hard he couldn't cry out. Each time, Kai circled back and stood there, a solid wall of warmth and dog smell, until Andrew could haul himself free. The dog never barked, never whined, just waited. Somewhere behind them, Henry and Tom were trailing, but the storm had swallowed their signals long ago. Andrew was utterly alone with the dog and the memory of the silver button he had found in the note. MD, those initials had unlocked something in his mind during the long walk, a stray piece of gossip he'd heard at a trading post 2 years earlier about a trapper named Dunn traveling with a woman, not a wife, but a daughter. A fierce young woman who could shoot and skin game better than most men. Her name was Marin Dunn. If she was involved in any of this, then the caches might not just belong to a dead man. They might belong to a family that had been hiding in the wild for 2 winters, and the figure with the dragging foot might not even be Edgar. Andrew crested a low ridge and saw the cabin. It was a crude rectangle of rough logs, roof half collapsed, leaning hard to the north as if the wind itself had pushed it into a permanent cringe. A single thin line of smoke rose from the stone chimney, immediately torn apart by the blizzard. The door stood slightly ajar, and fresh tracks led to and from the threshold, overlapping like someone had been packing. Andrew drew his old Navy revolver and whispered to Kai to stay close. The dog's ears flattened, but he made no sound. Whatever was inside, Kai didn't see it as a threat, or had already met it before. Andrew pushed the door open with the barrel of the gun. Inside, the cabin was dim and cold, the fire in the hearth barely alive. And a woman was sitting against the back wall, a rifle across her knees, her eyes fixed on Andrew with the calm of someone who had already calculated whether she could kill him and decided to wait. She was young, maybe 22, with a sharp jaw and hollow cheeks that spoke of months without proper food. Her left leg was wrapped in dirty cloth, stained through with old blood, and she held a small silver button in her fingers, rubbing it the way a person might work a worry stone. The initials on her coat matched the one Andrew had found. MD Marin Dunn. "You came alone," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "Good. I was afraid you'd bring the others and ruin everything." Andrew holstered the revolver slowly, his eyes never leaving her rifle. "You're Edgar Dunn's daughter. I found your button with the note." She nodded once, a tight, pained motion. "My father is dead. He's been dead for 18 months. The man following you is the one who killed him." The words landed like a physical blow. Andrew took a step forward and the young woman's rifle barrel lifted slightly. Not a threat, a warning to keep distance. Her story came out in fragments, broken by the wind screaming through the chinks in the walls. Edgar Dunn had not vanished 2 winters earlier. He had been murdered in the Bighorn foothills by a man named Lyle Stern, a trapper who'd partnered with him for the season. Stern had learned the location of Dunn's caches, not just the 4 marked on the map, but a fifth, a master cache that held 3 years' worth of prime furs and a small fortune in raw gold dust gathered from a secret claim. Stern wanted it all. He shot Edgar in the back near Sheep Creek and left him for dead. But Edgar didn't die right away. He crawled to this very cabin, where Marin was waiting, and lived long enough to give her the location of the master cache and make her swear to protect it from Stern. Then he died in her arms, and Marin had been surviving out here alone ever since, guarding the secret while Stern searched the territory for the prize he knew existed but couldn't find. "Came back to the basin last autumn," Marin continued, her voice dropping. "He thinks I'm dead too. I've been leaving false tracks, moving supplies, setting fires in empty camps to throw him off. But when your dog dug up the first cache, the pattern broke. I had to watch you. I had to make sure you weren't working with him." Andrew's mind reeled. The figure they'd been chasing wasn't helping them or hunting them, she was evaluating them. "The notes," Andrew said. "The warnings." "I wrote them," Marin said. "I knew the supplies would save your settlement, but I also knew that if Stern saw a group of homesteaders suddenly hauling out furs and kerosene, he'd slaughter every one of you to get to the map. The man is a stone-cold killer. He left my father to bleed out in the snow for 3 days just to hear him suffer. But the worst part hadn't even landed yet." Marin shifted her injured leg and winced. "Stern has been watching Crow Creek for weeks. He saw the light in your cabin the night you opened the first chest. He knows you have the ledger. And right now, while we sit here, he's somewhere between us and your settlement, waiting for you to lead him to the master cache. If I don't take you there first, he'll kill you, your family, and anyone else who stands between him and that gold." The blizzard outside howled as if to underscore the threat. Andrew's blood went cold. He thought of Alina and his son, alone in the cabin, with a killer possibly already circling. Henry and Tom were out there in the storm, unaware that the real danger wasn't a wounded old trapper but a predator who had been one step ahead the entire time. And the master cache, the one Marin was protecting, held not just wealth but the key to Stern's capture. Because the furs and gold were one thing, but Edgar Dunn had also hidden something else in that cache. A written confession from Stern, signed during a drunken campfire months before the murder, detailing a previous crime, a claim jump and killing in Montana territory that had gone unsolved. Edgar had kept it as insurance, and Stern knew it existed. If that document reached a territorial marshal, Stern would hang. That was the real reason he wouldn't let the cache go. The furs were money, the gold was freedom, but the document was a noose. Marin finally lowered the rifle. I can't walk far on this leg. I've been trying to heal it for 2 months, but it won't set right. That's why I needed you to come alone. I need a man I can trust to carry the load to reach the icebox before Stern does. I'll tell you exactly where it is, but you have to promise me 2 things. First, you'll take enough supplies from the master cache to get your people through spring. Second, you'll make sure that confession reaches the law. If Stern gets to it first and destroys it, he walks free forever, and he will keep killing. Andrew looked at Kai, who had settled at Marin's feet, his head resting on his paws. The dog had accepted her. That was endorsement enough for Andrew. How do I know Stern won't already be waiting at the icebox? Marin pulled a small leather pouch from inside her coat and handed it to Andrew. Inside were 2 things, a key, heavy and iron, and a hand-drawn map to a location deep in a canyon that would stay frozen until well into April. He doesn't have the key. The cache is buried under a rockfall, locked with an iron box. No key, no gold, and he doesn't know about the confession. He thinks it's just furs. We have one advantage. He's chasing what he thinks is the prize, but he doesn't understand the full stakes yet. Andrew pocketed the pouch. I'll go tonight. I'll need to warn Henry and Tom and get them back to the settlement to protect the families. If Stern is already close, we don't have much time. Marin nodded. There's a trail behind the cabin that cuts west and follows a dry wash. It's longer, but it will get you around Stern's likely position. He'll be watching the main route. Take the wash, move fast, and don't stop until you're back in the settlement. Then get to the icebox before the next dawn. Once the storm passes, the melt will make the canyon impassable and the cache will be sealed until summer, when Stern can just dig it out at his leisure. Andrew turned to leave, but Marin's voice stopped him. One more thing. My father's body is still in this cabin. I couldn't bury him because the ground is frozen. He's in the back room. When this is over, I want him given a proper burial, not left here for the scavengers. Andrew promised. As he stepped back out into the snow with Kai, he saw Henry and Tom emerging from the white, their faces raw with cold and confusion. They had followed the trail and heard voices. Andrew quickly relayed the situation. Dunn was dead, his daughter was inside, the killer Stern was circling, and the master cache had to be secured immediately or they'd all be murdered. The revelation shifted the entire dynamic. The rescue mission had become a live siege. That was when Tom pointed toward the ridge they crossed an hour earlier. A thin column of smoke rose on the far side, not from a chimney but from a campfire. Someone was there. Someone was watching the cabin. Stern had found them or had never lost them to begin with. The circle was closing. The race to the fourth cache had just begun, and the price of failure was not just hunger. It was a bullet for everyone in Crow Creek. Andrew pulled Henry and Tom close, his voice a raw whisper against the wind. Stern's up there. If all 3 of us go for the icebox, he'll follow and we'll lead him straight to the master cache. Instead, we split. You 2 get Marin back to the settlement fast and arm every man there. If Stern circles around, he'll find a fight, not a slaughter. I'll take the wash trail alone with Kai. The dog and I can move quicker, and I've got the key. Tom started to object, but Henry, his face a weathered map of hard decisions, simply nodded. You get that confession, Andrew. If you don't, none of this matters. We'll hold the settlement until you return or until hell freezes over. Marin, leaning heavily on a crude crutch, pressed the iron key into Andrew's palm one final time. The icebox is a narrow cut in the canyon, east of the dry falls. There's a dead spruce at the entrance. The rock fall looks natural, but the iron box is wedged under the third boulder from the left. You'll need to dig through frozen gravel, but the box is there. And Andrew," she added, her eyes sharp despite the pain, "if you see Stern, don't hesitate. He won't." Then they were moving. Henry and Tom lifted Marin onto the crude sled and began the slow trek south toward Crow Creek. Andrew watched them vanish into the veil of snow, then turned west with Kai and plunged into the dry wash Marin had described. The narrow channel cut between high earthen banks, the snow shallower here, the wind deflected overhead, creating a strange tunnel of relative silence. Kai moved ahead with unerring certainty, his nose working the air, occasionally glancing back at Andrew as if to say faster. Andrew's body was a catalog of pain, his frozen hand, the ache in his thighs, the raw burn of frost on his cheeks, but his mind was a single furious point of focus. The confession was everything. Without it, Stern would simply bide his time, slaughter the witnesses, and disappear with the gold. With it, the man could be dragged before a territorial court, and the families of Crow Creek might know peace beyond mere survival. The wash twisted and narrowed. The snow grew deeper, the temperature dropping so far that the sky turned a pale, brittle blue even as the sun began its brief winter arc overhead. Andrew chewed a strip of dried venison from his pocket and kept moving, refusing to stop. Kai would sometimes freeze, ears forward, growling low, and Andrew would hold his breath until the dog relaxed. Each time he feared Stern had outflanked them, but the trail remained empty. In the killing cold, isolation felt like a weapon that cut both ways. After what felt like hours, Andrew smelled the falls before he saw them. A faint iron tang of exposed rock, a dampness frozen into ice. The dry falls was a 20-foot basalt wall, now glazed with frozen seepage, and to its left, a dark split in the canyon wall marked the entrance to the icebox. The dead spruce, lightning-charred and skeletal, stood sentinel exactly where Marin had promised. Andrew knelt behind a boulder and studied the terrain. The canyon beyond was a narrow gash, shadowed and still. No tracks, no smoke, no sign of Stern, but that meant nothing. The man had survived 2 winters tracking Marin. He knew how to hide. Andrew crept forward, Kai at his heel. The rockfall at the end of the canyon was a jumbled heap of fractured granite and frozen soil, evidence of a long-ago slide. He found the third boulder from the left, a slab half the size of a wagon, and began scraping away the frozen gravel beneath it with his gloved hands. The cold bit through the leather instantly, numbing his fingertips, but he kept digging. An inch, then 2, then his knuckles struck cold iron. The box was smaller than the earlier chests, heavy and rusted at the seams, but solid. Andrew inserted the key, and the lock turned with a scream that echoed through the canyon. Inside, packed tight against the cold, were 3 things. A thick leather folder containing folded documents, the edges brittle with frost. The confession, signed in Stern's own hand, detailing the Montana Claim murder from 1879. Beside it, a heavy canvas sack of raw gold dust, maybe 5 pounds, enough to buy an entire year's supplies for the settlement. And beneath that, rolled tight in oilskin, the prize furs. 2 prime silver fox, 4 marten, and a single deep black beaver pelt so fine it would fetch $100 in St. Louis. Andrew secured the confession inside his coat first, then the gold, then bundled the furs. As he stood, Kai growled, not forward but back toward the entrance. Lyle Stern stepped out of the shadows, a rifle leveled at Andrew's chest. He was a lean man with a face carved by greed and cold, his beard matted, his eyes small and glittering with something between amusement and hate. He had not come from the settlement path. He had climbed down the canyon wall from above, patient as a spider. "I'll take that box now," he said, his voice calm, "and the map and the dog. Then you can freeze here just like old Edgar did." Andrew clutched the bundle and stared into the rifle barrel. Kai crouched, a low rumble building. But Stern had made one mistake. He had underestimated the dog. Edgar Dunn had trained Kai since he was a pup, and the animal had been taught to respond to a single whistle, a high-pitched note that Marin had demonstrated to Andrew before they parted. Andrew puckered his lips and blew. The shrill note cut through the canyon. Kai didn't hesitate. The dog exploded forward, not at Stern's legs, but at the rifle itself. Stern fired high, the shot cracking off the canyon wall, and then Kai's jaws locked onto the stock and wrenched the weapon sideways. Andrew lunged, drawing the revolver, and cracked the barrel across Stern's skull. The man dropped stunned. Andrew kicked the rifle away and stood over him, breathing hard, the dog still snarling. "The confession is going to the marshal," Andrew said. "You're going in chains, and every family you threatened is going to live through this winter." By nightfall, Andrew had bound Stern's wrists with leather cord and began the long march back to Crow Creek. Kai guarded the prisoner every step, his yellow eyes never leaving the killer's face. When Andrew finally staggered into the settlement, the sky was pink with a bitter dawn. The entire community had gathered, armed with axes and skinning knives, ready for a siege. Henry and Tom had brought Marin safely, and Alina was there, running through the snow to meet him, their son's cough already easing thanks to the third cache's dried beans and kerosene heat. Andrew handed the confession to Henry, who could read it aloud to the assembly, and the gold and furs were spread on a plank table for all to see. The supplies from the master cache alone would buy passage for a supply train come spring. The settlement would not just survive, it would rebuild. That night around a roaring fire, Marin finally spoke the words that turned a rescue into a legend. She knelt beside Kai and stroked his thick fur, tears freezing on her cheeks. "This dog was my father," she said. "He was lost in a blizzard 2 years ago, the same storm that took my father's horse. We thought him dead. He must have wandered south, half-starved, until some trapper or homesteader took him in." She looked at Andrew, who had found Kai as a stray pup shivering near the creek the previous winter. "He didn't just find a buried cache. He came home. He remembered every one of my father's hiding spots because he had helped dig them as a young dog. The snowbank was his memory." The revelation settled over the crowd. The dog that refused to leave a snowbank had not merely stumbled upon an abandoned stash. He had led them back to his own history, to the legacy of a murdered trapper, and in doing so, saved 4 families from starvation. That single faithful animal had unraveled a killer's plan, unearthed a fortune, and returned a lost daughter to the world. In the spring, Stern was taken to Fort Laramie and hanged for his crimes, the confession a damning epilogue. Edgar Dunn was buried beside the creek at Sheep Creek, a stone cairn built by the hands of every man in Crow Creek. And Kai lived out his remaining years in front of the Colby fire, a hero of the settlement, proof that on the frontier, loyalty sometimes smelled like wet fur and frozen snow, and refused to let you sleep until you followed. Loyalty on the frontier smelled like wet fur and frozen snow, and it refused to let a man sleep until he followed. Because Andrew Colby followed, Crow Creek did not become another ghost settlement buried by the blizzards of 1883. Instead, it survived, rebuilt, and quietly entered the unwritten history of places that should have died but didn't. The supplies from those caches fed 4 families through the final hungry months of winter, and the gold and furs bought seed, tools, and enough goodwill at the trading posts to anchor the settlement for years to come. Marin Dunn eventually married a younger homesteader from a neighboring basin, and together they raised children who grew up hearing the story of a dog that remembered every hiding spot his first master had ever shown him. Edgar Dunn's cairn at Sheep Creek became a quiet landmark, a place travelers would pause at, not because they knew the full story, but because the air around it felt different, still, watching. And Lyle Stern, the man who thought he could kill his way to fortune, learned a hard truth inside a frozen canyon. The wilderness keeps its own records. The confession he had signed in a moment of drunken arrogance, never believing it would survive, had lain preserved in the iron box like an accusation waiting for its moment. When the territorial marshal read it aloud in Fort Laramie that spring, Stern's face reportedly showed no anger, only the hollow exhaustion of a man who had finally been outrun by the past. The hanging took place on a gray morning in late April, with no mourners and no marker. But the question that lingered over Crow Creek long after the snow melted was not about guilt or justice. It was about memory. How did a dog, separated from his original owner by 2 winters and 100 miles of frozen wilderness, know exactly where to dig. Kai had helped Edgar Dunn bury those caches as a young dog. Yes, but the assumption on the frontier was always that animals lived in the immediate present, driven by hunger and instinct, not the pull of old loyalties. Yet here was a dog that had stopped eating to stand beside a snowbank and whimper, a dog that had scrapped at frozen ground with bloody paws until a man finally listened. What did Kai know that the humans around him had forgotten? Was it the scent of the waxed canvas, still faint after 2 years? The specific shape of the cottonwood tree that marked the spot? Or was it something harder to name? A mental map formed during months of traveling with a trapper, a map so deeply imprinted that even time and distance couldn't erase it. Frontier survival stories usually celebrate human grit. The man who walked 30 miles in a blizzard, the mother who kept her children warm with nothing but blankets and courage. But those stories often leave out the animals who made survival possible. The horse that found the trail when the rider was blind with snow. The mule that refused to cross thin ice and saved an entire wagon train. The dog that knew, with absolute certainty, that something precious was buried beneath an unremarkable snowbank and would not be silenced until that something was brought back into the light. These animals weren't just tools. They were partners with their own intelligence, their own loyalties, and sometimes their own unfinished business. Edgar Dunn's caches were never meant to be a treasure hunt. They were a careful man's insurance policy against hard winters and bad luck, scattered across the basin in a deliberate rhythm. Cottonwood, split rock, snake-tongue fork, the icebox. Each one held enough supplies to get a desperate person to the next, a life-saving breadcrumb trail designed by someone who knew the territory better than anyone alive. And the final master cache, the one that held the confession and the gold and the finest furs, was tucked away in a place only a trapper of extraordinary patience would find. Dunn had built his legacy not with monuments, but with small, hidden acts of foresight that outlived him and in the end brought down his killer. That is a kind of justice the frontier rarely delivered, and when it did, it was seldom as neat as a trial and a noose. So perhaps the real story of those four saved families isn't just about a dog that found a cache. It's about the invisible threads that connect loyalty across species and across years. Edgar Dunn trained a dog, and that dog loved him enough to remember his scent, his patterns, his hiding spots. Years later, that same dog found a new home with a struggling homesteader who was desperate enough to trust an animal's strange behavior. And when the moment came, when the snow was deep and the food was gone and the wind howled like the end of everything, the dog didn't hesitate. He went to a snowbank and he dug. Not for treasure, not for glory. For the same reason any of us go back to the things that matter, because somewhere deep in his bones, he knew that what was buried there could save the people he loved. Subscribe now to uncover more forgotten stories from the American frontier, where the wind still carries names and the ice still holds secrets we haven't yet guessed. Because every snowbank might have a story, and every faithful animal might be the one to unlock it.